That house belongs to your sister!
Then explain why my signature was forged. Lock the courtroom doors. Nobody leaves.
3 days after I bought my first house, my parents dragged me into court and told a judge that it belonged to my sister. They came carrying contracts with my signature on them. There was only one problem. I had never signed those papers. And when my attorney placed a police report on the judge's desk, my father's face went pale. The bailiff locked the courtroom doors, and nobody was allowed to leave. My name is Claire Bennett. I was 32 years old when I learned that sometimes the people who teach you to love are also the people you must learn to survive. For most of my life, my younger sister, Madison, was the center of our family. If Madison failed a test, the teacher was unfair. If she lost a job, her boss was jealous. If she spent her rent money on a weekend trip, somebody else was expected to rescue her. That somebody was usually me. I started working at 16. Half of every paid into an account my father called the Family Emergency Fund. Somehow, every emergency had Madison's name on it. When I earned a scholarship to college, my parents skipped my awards dinner because Madison had a dance rehearsal. When I graduated, they left before my name was called because she had locked herself out of their house. I told myself it did not matter. That became my favorite lie. After college, I took a job as a project coordinator for a commercial construction company in Columbus, Ohio. I worked long hours, learned everything I could, and slowly moved up. By 32, I was managing renovations worth millions of dollars. Still, I lived in a small apartment with old carpet and a window that faced a brick wall. I had one goal, a home of my own. For 8 years, I saved. I skipped expensive vacations. I drove the same car until the heater worked only when I kicked the dashboard. I brought lunch from home and deposited every bonus. Then I found it. The house stood on Maple Hollow Road, 20 minutes outside the city. It was a modest 2-story home with white siding, a wide front porch, and a bright blue door. An old maple tree shaded the yard. The kitchen needed work, but morning light poured through its windows. The moment I stepped inside, I could imagine a life there. Not my parents' life. Not Madison's life. Mine. The house cost $385,000. I put down $80,000 from my savings, secured a conventional mortgage in my name, and signed every document in front of a title agent. At closing, the agent, Mrs. Alvarez, slid the keys across the table. "Congratulations, Claire," she said. "You did this?" I almost cried. That evening, I stood alone in the empty living room eating pizza from the box. Every sound echoed. The sunset turned the walls gold, and for the first time in years, silence did not feel lonely. It felt safe. I sent my parents a picture of me holding the keys. My mother replied first, "Beautiful. We'll come Sunday." My father sent a thumbs up. Madison did not respond. Sunday afternoon, they arrived together. My mother walked from room to room opening cabinets without asking. My father inspected the windows and furnace as though I had hired him. Madison stood in the center of the kitchen wearing sunglasses on top of her head. "This is bigger than I expected," she said. "Thanks," I replied. She looked out at the fenced backyard. "Tyler would love this." Tyler was her 6-year-old son. I loved my nephew had been using him as a key to every locked door since the day he was born. My mother turned toward me. "You know, Madison and Tyler need more room." I laughed because I thought it was a joke. Nobody else laughed. My father folded his arms. "Your apartment was fine for you. My apartment was temporary," I said. "I bought this house to live in." Madison took off her sunglasses. "You live alone. What do you need 3 bedrooms for?" There it was. Not congratulations. Not pride. An accusation. I set 4 glasses of lemonade on the counter. "I worked for this house," I said. "I don't have to justify it." My mother sighed. "Nobody is attacking you. We're discussing what makes sense for the family." "There is nothing to discuss." Madison's eyes filled with tears so quickly that I wondered whether she had practiced. "I knew you'd say that." So she grabbed Tyler's hand and walked out. My mother followed, whispering, "You always make everything difficult." My father stayed behind. He leaned closer and lowered his voice. "Your sister has had a hard life. You have always been more capable. That means you carry more. I've carried enough." His expression changed. The warmth vanished. "Be careful, Claire. Pride can cost people more than they think." Then he walked out. I locked the blue door behind him. The next morning, I returned to my apartment to pack. At 9:15, a man in a gray suit knocked. "Claire Bennett." "Les." He handed me an envelope. "You've been served." Inside was an emergency complaint filed by my parents, Robert and Elaine Bennett. They claimed I had used money belonging to a family trust to buy the house. They claimed I had agreed, in writing, to hold the property for Madison and Tyler. They wanted the court to stop me from moving in and transfer ownership to my sister. The hearing was scheduled for the next morning. I read the complaint 3 times. Attached was a document titled Family Housing Agreement. At the bottom was my name. Above it was a signature that looked almost exactly like mine. My hands were shaking when I called Daniel Reyes. Daniel was an attorney my company used for contract disputes. He was calm, precise, and famous for noticing details everyone else missed. He met me in his office an hour later. For 20 minutes, he read without speaking. "Did you sign this?" he finally asked. "No." "Did your down payment come from a family account?" "No. Every dollar from my personal savings." "Can you prove that?" "Less." Daniel nodded. "Then the house is probably safe. But this case is not really about the house." He pointed to the signature. "This is forgery, and whoever created it expected the court to believe it." I felt cold. My parents wouldn't risk prison over a house. Daniel looked at me for a long moment. "Claire," they filed it under oath. "We spent the afternoon gathering bank statements, closing records, emails, and payroll deposits. Every dollar of my down payment could be traced." At 6, Daniel asked whether my parents ever had access to my identification. "Years ago," I said. "My father helped me open my first bank account." "More recently?" 3 weeks earlier, my mother had invited me to dinner. Halfway through the meal, she said Tyler needed emergency dental work. She asked me for $5,000. I refused. When I returned from the restroom, my purse had been moved from the back of my chair to the floor. At the time, I assumed a server had bumped it. Now my stomach tightened. I checked my wallet. My driver's license was there. So were my credit cards. Daniel asked, "Do you keep copies of financial documents at your apartment?" "In a locked desk drawer." I drove home and found no sign of forced entry. But the lock on the drawer had a fresh scratch. Inside, my mortgage pre-approval letter was missing. So was a photocopy of my social security card. Daniel told me not to touch anything else. At 7:40, 2 Columbus police officers arrived. They photographed the drawer and took my statement. One officer, Sergeant Naomi Price, asked whether anyone had a key. "My parents," I said, "for emergencies." The words tasted bitter. She asked when I had last seen the missing papers. I told her I was not sure. Then I remembered something else. The previous Friday, the smart camera in my hallway had sent an alert while I was at work. When I checked the app, the clip showed nothing but a dark screen. I assumed the camera had malfunctioned. Sergeant Price asked to see the device. The camera had not malfunctioned. It had been unplugged. She requested access to the building's security footage. At 11 that night, she called me. "Your father entered your building 8 days ago," she said. "He used a key. He stayed for 19 minutes. My knees nearly gave way. Was he alone? He entered alone. But a woman matching your sister's description was waiting in a car outside. The next morning, Daniel met me on the courthouse steps. "Listen carefully," he said. "Your parents asked for an emergency order. That means they want speed. People who want speed are often afraid of what time will reveal." Inside the courtroom, my mother wore a navy dress she used for church. My father sat straight-backed beside her. Madison was behind them, dressed in pale gray, holding Tyler's school picture against her chest. They looked like a wounded family. I looked like the selfish daughter who had stolen a child's home. Their attorney, Leonard Pike, told Judge Helen Whitmore that my parents had liquidated a long-held investment account to help me buy property for Madison. He presented the family housing agreement. He presented a bank statement showing an $80,000 transfer into an account bearing my name. For one terrible second, I could not breathe. Daniel leaned over. "That account is not yours, is it?" "I've never seen it." My father took the witness stand. He said I had agreed to act as a temporary buyer because Madison's credit was poor. He said I changed my mind after closing because I became emotionally attached to the house. My mother cried quietly. Then Madison testified. Claire told Tyler he would finally have a yard. She said that part was almost true. During their visit, Tyler had asked whether he could play outside. I said, of course. Madison turned one ordinary sentence into a promise of ownership. Daniel did not object much. He took notes. When it was our turn, he presented my real bank records. He showed 8 years of deposits and the transfer from my savings directly to the title company. Then he showed that the account named in my parents' evidence had been opened only 9 days earlier. Pike stood. "The source of those funds remains a factual dispute." Daniel replied, "It is more than a dispute, Your Honor." He placed a document before the judge. "This is a police report filed last night. It concerns burglary, identity theft, and suspected financial fraud. Building footage shows Mr. Bennett entering my client's apartment 8 days ago. Documents used to establish the account in question disappeared during that visit." My father's face went pale. Judge Whitmore read the first page, then the second. She looked at my father. "Did you disclose an active criminal investigation to your attorney?" Pike slowly turned toward him. My father said nothing. The judge pressed a button beneath her desk. 2 deputies entered. "Lock the doors," she ordered. "No party or witness leaves this courtroom." Madison stood so fast her chair fell backward. "I need to pick up my son." The judge's voice hardened. "Sit down, Ms. Bennett." That was the first time I saw real fear in my sister's eyes. But it was not the last. Judge Whitmore sealed the hearing and ordered all phones surrendered. Sergeant Price entered through a side door, with a detective from the Financial Crimes Unit. The detective carried a laptop and a thick evidence bag. He whispered to Daniel, then handed him a single sheet of paper. Daniel's expression changed. "Claire," he said quietly, "there is more." The fraudulent account had been opened online using my name, social security number, and a photograph of my driver's license. The $80,000 had never existed. The statement was fabricated, but that was not the worst part. During their investigation, police found 3 credit cards opened in my name over the previous 18 months. The balances totaled $47,000. All 3 cards had been mailed to my parents' address. Most of the purchases were connected to Madison. Furniture, designer clothes, a vacation rental in Florida, tuition at a private school Tyler attended for 1 semester. Cash advances used to cover overdue rent. My parents had not simply tried to steal my house. They had been stealing my identity for more than a year. I stared at Madison. She shook her head. "I didn't know the cards were in your name." My father snapped. "Stop talking." That sentence told everyone who was in control. Detective Warren testified that police had executed an emergency search warrant that morning after seeing my father on the apartment footage. In a locked filing cabinet at my parents' home. They found copies of my tax returns, my social security card, and a practice sheet covered with versions of my signature. They also found a notary stamp belonging to a woman named Cynthia Hale. Cynthia worked with my mother at a medical billing office. The family housing agreement carried Cynthia's seal. Judge Whitmore asked whether Cynthia had notarized the document. Detective Warren said, "Ms. Hale reported her stamp stolen 2 months ago." My mother covered her mouth. Her attorney stepped away from the table, as though betrayal were contagious. Then the detective revealed the plan. My parents knew they could not simply transfer my house to Madison. They needed a court order that would create an appearance of legitimacy. If Judge Whitmore had granted the emergency petition, they intended to record a transfer deed, place the property into an entity controlled by my father, and borrow against the equity. The house was not a gift for Madison. It was collateral. My father had accumulated more than $200,000 in gambling debt through private poker games and online betting accounts. He had already borrowed against my parents' home. The men he owed were demanding payment. Madison was the story they used to make their fraud look like sacrifice. I remembered my father standing in my kitchen, telling me that pride could cost people more than they thought. He had not been warning me. He had been warning himself. Judge Whitmore gave every defendant a chance to speak after consulting with counsel. My father invoked his right to remain silent. My mother did not. She began crying before she reached the witness chair. "Robert said we were only borrowing her information," she whispered. "He said Claire had excellent credit and would never notice." I felt something inside me go still. My mother looked directly at me. "We were going to pay it back. With my house?" I asked. The judge told me not to interrupt, but my mother answered anyway. "Your sister was going to live there for a while. It would have helped everyone." Even then, she could not say they were wrong. She could only explain why I was easier to hurt. Madison's attorney requested that she be allowed to testify under a limited immunity agreement. The prosecutor who had arrived during the sealed hearing refused to promise anything, but Madison talked anyway. She admitted that she waited outside my apartment. She admitted that she gave my father a recent photograph of my signature from a birthday card. She admitted that she knew the court agreement was false. But she insisted she believed the house would become hers. "Mom said Claire didn't need it," she cried. "She said Claire always lands on her feet." I looked at her and finally understood our entire childhood. My strength had never inspired them. It had excused them. Every time I survived, they treated it as proof that hurting me had no cost. Daniel asked to present one final item. It was a recorded phone call. That morning, after police first contacted my mother, she had called me. I did not answer, so she left a voicemail. At first, there was only rustling. Then I heard my father in the background. "If Claire fights this, tell her we'll say she stole from us. The court will believe 3 people before it believes 1. My mother asked, "What if they check the account?" My father replied, "By the time they do, the deed will be recorded." The courtroom was completely silent. Judge Whitmore removed her glasses. "Mr. Bennett," she said, "you attempted to use this court as an instrument of fraud." My father stared at the floor. The judge dismissed their claim with prejudice. She referred the evidence to the county prosecutor, ordered the fraudulent filings preserved, and issued a protection order preventing my parents in Madison from contacting me or approaching my home. Then Detective Warren arrested my father. My mother was arrested for identity fraud, conspiracy, and filing false documents. Madison was taken into custody for questioning. As deputies led my father toward the side door, he looked back at me. There was no apology in his face, only blame. "You destroyed this family," he said. For the first time in my life, I did not defend myself. I simply answered, "No. I stopped you from destroying me." The criminal case lasted 11 months. Those months were harder than the courtroom victory. Identity theft does not disappear because the truth is discovered. It lives in reports, calls, disputed bills, frozen accounts, and letters from companies that treat you like a suspect. I spent evenings documenting charges I had never made. I changed every password. I froze my credit. I answered investigators' questions until every memory felt contaminated. Daniel helped me sue the companies that ignored obvious warning signs. He also filed a civil action against my parents in Madison for damages. Meanwhile, relatives began calling. My aunt said my father had made a terrible mistake, but should not lose his freedom. My uncle said my mother had been manipulated. My grandmother told me Madison was still my sister. They all asked some version of the same question. Couldn't I show mercy? Nobody asked why my family had shown none to me. So I wrote one response and sent it to everyone. Mercy does not require me to become available for further harm. The courts will decide the consequences. I am choosing safety. Then I blocked their numbers. My father eventually pleaded guilty to identity fraud, forgery, burglary, conspiracy, and attempting to obtain property by deception. Because the scheme involved the court and multiple financial accounts, he received 6 years in state prison. My mother cooperated with prosecutors. She received 18 months in county custody followed by probation and was ordered to pay restitution. Madison pleaded guilty to conspiracy and identity theft. Her sentence included 9 months in jail, community service, probation, and mandatory financial counseling. Tyler went to live with his father, Aaron, who had spent years fighting for more custody. That was the one part that brought me peace. Aaron called me once. "Tyler thinks this happened because he wanted a backyard," he said. My heart broke. I asked to speak to him. "Buddy," I said, "none of this was your fault. Grown-ups made bad choices. You did nothing wrong. Are you mad at me?" "Never." He was quiet. "Do you still have the blue door?" I looked across my living room. "I do." "Good," he said. "Blue is my favorite." After the call, I sat on the floor and cried harder than I had cried in court. Justice can stop people from hurting you, but it cannot return the years you spent believing their behavior was love. The civil case ended with a settlement. My parents' house was sold to pay existing debt and part of the restitution. I recovered enough to cover my legal expenses and repair the damage to my credit. I could have demanded every remaining dollar. Instead, I requested one unusual condition. My father owned a small undeveloped lot outside Dayton. He had bought it years earlier and often promised Madison that he would build her a house there. I asked for the land. His lawyer laughed when Daniel made the proposal. My father did not. He understood what it meant. He had tried to steal the first property I ever owned. Now the last property in his name would become mine. The court approved the transfer. 2 years after the first hearing, I used the lot to start the Bennett Safe Start Fund, a small nonprofit project that partnered with a local housing organization. We built 2 compact homes for women leaving financially abusive families. I did not name the project after my parents. I named it after myself. For most of men, if the Bennett name had meant obligation, silence, and an equal love, I decided it could mean something else. On the day the first woman received her keys, she stood outside a little white house with trembling hands. Her daughter ran across the porch. The front door was blue. Daniel stood beside me during the ceremony. "You know," he said, "most people would have sold the land." I thought about it. "What changed your mind?" I watched the mother unlock the door. "My father believed a house was something you could use to control another person," I said. "I wanted to prove it could also set someone free." My own home changed too. I renovated the kitchen, planted hydrangeas along the porch, and turned one upstairs bedroom into an office. The other became a guest room. Tyler visited once a month after Aaron, and I rebuilt trust. He had his own shelf of books and a small telescope by the window. Madison wrote to me from jail. Her first letter blamed our father. Her second blamed our mother. Her third blamed her childhood. I returned all 3 unopened. A year after her release, she sent one final letter through Daniel. This time it contained no excuses. She wrote that she had spent her whole life believing love meant receiving whatever she wanted. She said she was learning that love without respect was only entitlement wearing a friendly face. She did not ask me to forgive her. She asked whether, someday, I might allow her to apologize in person. I kept that letter. I have not answered yet. Forgiveness is not a door other people get to unlock because they are tired of standing outside. It belongs to the person who was hurt. Maybe one day I will open it. Maybe I will not. Either choice is mine. On the 3rd anniversary of buying my house, I sat on the front porch while a summer storm rolled across the Ohio sky. Rain tapped against the roof. Tyler was inside making hot chocolate, even though it was warm outside. I thought about the woman I had been on closing day. She believed the greatest thing those keys gave her was property. She was wrong. The house gave me a boundary. My family crossed it. The court gave me justice. But I gave myself something even more important: permission to stop carrying people who only loved me when I was useful. My parents tried to convince a judge that my home belonged to my sister. In the end, they lost their money, their freedom, and the daughter they assumed would always forgive them. I kept the house. I kept my name. And every time I turn the key in that blue door, I remember the truth they never expected me to learn: a home is not merely the place you own. It is the place where nobody else gets to decide what you deserve.